Hi, Chris. Welcome to the podcast. We are here hosting Chris Summerville, and he is the CEO of Schizophrenia Society in Canada. And maybe can you just tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, Daniel, thank you very much for having me today, and I'm really looking forward to this and talking with you. I certainly do have a strong passion for mental health and mental illness and wellness and resiliency and well-being, and I think it's been a passion most of my life. I'm 68 years old, and from my accent, many people will realize that I must have been born in the southern part of the United States. In fact, I was born in Birmingham, Alabama, 1952. And there were a lot of mental health challenges and mental health problems and even mental illness in the Summerville family. So my father struggled with what we would know as bipolar disorder along with alcoholism or alcohol use disorder. And he eventually took his life by suicide at age 70. And that was 3 years after the first death in the Summerville family, and that was my youngest sister, Cherie. And she struggled with depression, and she had been using alcohol all that day in March of 1985. And she was killed in an automobile accident when she ran off the road. And then I have a brother who's still living. He's 72, and he has schizophrenia, which was probably induced by cannabis use when he was in Vietnam. And then another brother with bipolar disorder. And all of them, they did struggle with substance use disorder. That's not unusual. About 75% of people who have an enduring mental illness will use substances, whether that's for self-medication or it's inherently part of the illness factor. But yeah, he struggled, and a couple of years ago, he took his life by suicide. And then myself, I can remember, Daniel, when I was a teenager, I would experience what psychiatrists call dissociation, derealization, depersonalization, and that's kind of like a psychosis in some sense, or a dissociation in which you're not sure if you exist in reality. You can't determine. You don't even know if you're dreaming or alive. It was kind of like I was up in the corner of the ceiling wall and looking down on myself, and
Is it, sorry to interrupt you, is it kind of like a dreaming state when you know children are dreaming when you're a child?
Yeah,
is it kind of?
But I was a teenager, and I was fully conscious that this was happening. And basically, I would go to my room and darken the lights, and I'd pull the curtains and put a wet cloth on my forehead because I generally get a migraine headache. And then I would just go through the experience, the experience of dissociation, of not being able to determine if I was in a real time zone or not. It was very scary, and I would have that on and off for about 10 years. Mm-hmm. And I never did go to a doctor. My mother, I remember she came into my room when I was probably about 20, and she said, "Chris, maybe you should go see a psychiatrist." And to me, that was like going to see the Antichrist. Wow. Back in those days, the 60s and the 70s, we didn't talk about mental illness like we do today. It was
I can imagine, actually.
Yeah, you don't talk about the alcoholism. You don't talk about the depression. You don't talk about the problems that arise out of it in terms of its effect on the family. And consequently, then you're not allowed to feel. And if you can't talk and you can't feel, then the third rule of a dysfunctional family or home or bank or school or church is that you don't trust. And so it was a shame that bound us. We were bound in shame, and it was nothing like today. There weren't shelters for women. My father was abusive. Where was a woman to go with 7 children in the southern part of the United States in the 60s and 70s when divorce was unheard of? And sort of like that old country song, Tammy Wynette, you stand by your man. But thank goodness we've come a long ways. And if you're going to develop a mental illness, this is the best day to develop a mental illness. A lot of people find that kind of weird for me to make that statement, but it's my optimism that people who have mental health challenges, and we use different phrases: mental health problems, mental health issues, mental health challenges, mental illness, they are treatable and recovery is possible. So one of my passions is that I'm a very strong advocate here in Canada, locally, provincially, nationally, and internationally. I'm a strong advocate for recovery-oriented mental health systems. What we currently have in Canada is not a mental health system, but a mental illness system, in which someone stays in the hospital for 14 to 21 days. The goal is symptom control and stabilization. Then you're out, and there's lack of community supports. Trauma is hardly addressed. Adverse childhood experiences. That's making a comeback, and I'm glad it is amongst psychologists, because I think a lot of psychosis is really related to a trauma factor.
Let's just briefly get to the basics and try to describe the definitions of psychosis and trauma to people, because I guess not everyone exactly understands what it is.
Well, when we speak of schizophrenia, we're talking about a form of psychosis. So you have to start off with psychosis, and psychosis is when a person has difficulty determining what's real and what's not real, because one or more of the 5 senses are affected. And the most common one is that people hear voices that aren't really there, but they hear a literal voice, and sometimes they call themselves voice hearers. And there is the voice hearer movement, in which people go into groups as peers, and it's not so much a focus on medication as it is, how to live with the voices and have some sense of control over them. Because when you experience psychosis, you do feel like you're going crazy, and it's very scary. Some people have thoughts that are not real, so we call those delusions. That the police have bugged their house, or some people watch Wheel of Fortune and think that Vanna White is giving them a secret message through the letters that she places up on the board.
Wow.
Many things can cause psychosis, which interferes with your ability to determine what's real and what's not real. Epilepsy, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's disease, brain tumor, certain heart medication, cannabis, substance use. And then we have those classics, so to speak, called schizophrenia and bipolar 2. And you can have a postpartum psychosis. So the area that I work primarily in is early psychosis and schizophrenia and schizoaffective disorder. And schizophrenia is a diagnostic label. That's all it is. It's a label. It's not your identity. We don't know everything we'd like to know about it. We don't even really exactly know 100% what causes schizophrenia. It is thought that it is multiple illnesses. There will not be one gene that's discovered to be a cause. It's probably a number of hotspots on a number of genes, but epigenetics, which is the science of how genes express themselves, we now know that schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, psychosis, they're not completely genetic. And so there are environmental factors. And so that's where trauma comes in. And during World War II, either one or World War II, it was called shell shock. And now when soldiers come back from war, it's called PTSD.
Post-traumatic
trauma, yeah, post-traumatic
syndrome.
Trauma stress disorder. And trauma is when you experience a real hurt, a brain pain that psychologically it creates anxiety and fear, and you're very sensitive then to anything that resembles what's behind the trauma. So if you're in a war, loud noises, a gun going off, or you were to be in a very crowded place, and just even that could trigger trauma.
So it's basically the kind of, I guess, regular trauma mechanism that works in any other, like, let's say, I don't know, someone would have bad relationship, and then when they go into the new relationship, that they could have the same. Is it the similar one?
Yeah.
But related to the war, I guess.
Yeah, adverse childhood experiences are a form of trauma, and that's when children in utero or early childhood, they experience an environmental condition which frightens them, and the fight, flight response takes over, because the person doesn't quite know what to do with the reality that's happening, which is filled with fear and anxiety and danger to self. And it's part of the primitive brain, the reptilian brain, some scientists refer to, and it leaves a mark. It leaves a mark on that part of the brain, so that you're more sensitive to future experiences that would resurface the feelings of trauma, like fear, anxiety, that you're about to die. Your cortisol, stress hormone, you're overflowing with it. Your whole system is flooded with cortisol, and too much cortisol can lead to all kinds of mental and physiological health problems. So we know that children who have had adverse experiences, like an early death of a parent, or they are a refugee child, that they have higher rates of cancer, cardiovascular problems, blood pressure, higher rates of mental health problems. And so that makes for a strong case that mental illnesses generally are not just completely genetic, but the expression of those hot spots on the genes, the vulnerability, it's the stress factor that it exasperates one's mental health.
So, okay, as I understand, we can have both. It can be either genetic or the one that came to us during our childhood or any other trauma experience in life. And, generally speaking, the schizophrenia in this case is just a name, and then basically you could diagnose it with the different symptoms type of.
What psychiatrists do is they rule out all other possible causes of the psychosis, like thyroid imbalance. So many times the doctor will run thyroid tests, rule out a brain tumor. So once they've ruled out every other possible cause, and you have 6 months of delusions or hallucinations, experiences, then generally that diagnosis will be placed upon a person. A lot of psychiatrists won't give you that diagnosis because it's a very horrible diagnosis. It's filled with so much stigma, and there's so much prejudice and bigotry against people who are often called schizophrenics. I don't use that word. I use the expression people who live with a diagnosis of schizophrenia. And just living with the diagnosis is very painful because of being ostracized, the words that are used, crazy, nut bar, loose screw. One schizophrenic, always schizophrenic, which is not true. I mean, up to 60% or more people do experience a form of recovery from or in schizophrenia, which means they're able to get their life back. There may be some impairment, there may be some cognitive challenges, but based on what we know today through psychotherapy, medication, peer support, addressing trauma, people can do much better today than my brother, who is around 72 or 73 years old today. He, when he developed schizophrenia, we didn't know all these things that I'm talking with you about today. And in fact, in the late 1990s, in Australia, scientists did studies that demonstrated that the earlier you identify the struggle that the person is having, and the earlier you intervene and you help the person with various treatments, the less likely you'll go on to develop full-blown schizophrenia. So that's good news. But we have to be able to talk about mental health in elementary school, just like we do dental health. Yeah. And so that it's a normal conversation. So when a child is experiencing brain pain or emotional pain, we don't necessarily have to put a label on them, but we certainly can, make it normal. It can be normal to get help and normal to talk about it. Whereas in my family growing up in the 60s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, you didn't talk about it at all because there was so much shame associated with it.
Yep. Actually, the one of the goal for me today, generally speaking, I actually think as well that there are a lot of biases and a lot of stigma around mental health and in general, and especially about schizophrenia. And one of my questions that I wrote down, that shouldn't we even call it this name? Should we maybe introduce some other name? But you already answered it for me, even without me asking it. So that means that actually it all creates I believe a huge problem where it's super stressful for people that live in with some sort of condition, and for sure it doesn't help that we don't realize it, because I can imagine that those people they might feel left out and as a different part of the group, and that creates even more and more stress. So
well, the number one myth, the number one misconception about people living with schizophrenia, and it's a very strong one and devastating one, is that they're dangerous. Mm-hmm. And so in the Asian Pacific Rim, Japan, that area, the Asian Pacific Rim, those countries are changing in their language the word schizophrenia. Mm-hmm. Because it has negative connotations, and so they're choosing words that would be translated in English as a form of dissociation. And Dr. Gabor Mate, who works in Lower East Side, Vancouver, he believes that schizophrenia is a form of dissociation due to traumatic factors. Mm-hmm. Now, obviously, most psychiatrists would disagree with him. But if you listen to people's story, and instead of asking them what's wrong with you, if you ask them what happened to you, 9 times out of 10, they will tell you stories that are related to adverse childhood experiences or trauma, and then the psychosis comes about.
Okay. No, this is actually another thing that I wanted to to go, is to break down some like misconceptions right now, and few of the common things that people usually think. So we already covered that, it's not dangerous and it is treatable. And then, for example, what about can people with those diagnoses normally function and normally live in society? Can they like understand what's going on around, and what are the limitations?
Well, just like with any illness, you're going to have mild forms, moderate to severe. And obviously, the more severe, the more supports and services the person needs.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the key. The earlier you identify it and you provide a range of treatment options, from medication to talk therapy to peer support groups, addressing trauma, addressing anything that would be classified as emotional pain for the person, because that acts as a stressor. So even though we don't know what causes these mental illnesses, we know what triggers them. Mm-hmm. And the trigger is stress, because the person's brain is sort of sandpapered down. I use that analogy. And so it's more sensitive. It's more sensitive to stress. And so part of recovery is the person learning to deal with stress. That's just as important as the medication, is resolving unresolved trauma issues, learning principles of resiliency, having hopes and dreams and purpose. And we have to have a mental health system that fosters that. It can't just focus only on medication. And so people are able to gain their life back. There may be, as I said earlier, impairment, but many people live with impairments who go on to complete education and get a job, and we make workplace accommodations for them, or we have accommodations for them in college and university. And if we do the same thing for people with mental health problems, then we'll see better outcomes. And if we have strong community supports, and which means places like Schizophrenia Society or the Hearing Voices Network movement, or a mood disorder society, and then peer support is very important. That is, people with lived experience of a mental illness and recovery, and you're talking with them once you're newly diagnosed, and your question to the peer support worker is going to be, well, you really seem to understand what I'm going through. How did you get better? And so the power of lived experience is a powerful one. And I believe that when people get a diagnosis of a mental illness or mental health problem, one of the first things we ought to do is have them be able to talk to a peer support worker, someone who's been where they are and has achieved a level of recovery, and what helps them and what hinders their recovery. And everybody has to determine, what those things are. It's not the same for everybody. But having a close family, having people who love you, have meaning and purpose in life, finding medication, hopefully that does not have side effects, practicing good mental health. You can have mental illness and have good mental health. Dr. Corey Keyes writes about that. And that's the mental health continuum, is that, you have the vertical at the top, mental illness, at the bottom, no mental illness, and then you have the horizontal bar, negative mental health and positive mental health. So you can have a mental illness and have positive mental health. On the other hand, you may not have a mental illness and have negative mental health.
And in this case, what do we determine as mental health? What the definition?
Yeah. Well, mental health is the ability to deal with what life brings you. Life brings us good things, but life also brings us bad things. And mental health is the capacity of being able to bounce back. And that's why the word resiliency is used a lot. So if you think of a boat, and at the bottom of the boat, underneath the water, the bottom of the boat, there is this ridge that's called a keel. Mm-hmm. And the keel helps the boat not to flip over. And so that's resiliency. And so that's something that you even begin that prenatally in terms of having a good pregnancy, that's a healthy pregnancy psychologically, that there's no abuse and there's no hunger or famine. There's no toxicity in the environment. And then as the child is born, to be loved, and we build into the life of the child that they can bounce back, and so people learn ways of bouncing back from life, spirituality, mindfulness, exercise, enjoying creation and creatures, knowing how to connect with people in a healthy way, knowing how to manage stress. And so the big question is whether resiliency is taught or caught. It's probably a mixture of both. So if you have resilient parents, they're going to display that, they're going to model it, but they're also going to teach it. And I think that's where we need to put much more emphasis. It's like a river. If you're standing in a river and you see all these bodies coming down a river and you're just trying to pull the body out of the river where you are, you'll only be able to help so many people. But if you go upstream, if you go way upstream and find out what's putting people in this river, this toxic river of mental illness, and we have good prevention programs, so mental health prevention and mental health promotion can prevent a lot of suffering. But on the other hand, there can be people who live very good lives mentally and physically, and later on they develop a mental health problem or a mental illness. Right now with COVID-19, we are seeing an exponentially great increase in mental health challenges because the coronavirus is very challenging.
Oh, yeah.
People speak of these are troubling times, these are stressful times. We don't know what the new normal is, and people are wanting to get back to their normal lives and connecting with people and socializing and being able to do things. And because of quarantines, and the reason why we have quarantine is so the healthcare system won't collapse. Everyone will eventually get this virus. Many scientists believe it's kind of like the flu. So once quarantine and people again mingle again, there probably will be a second wave and a third wave. But because it's interfering with our life as we know it, in terms of our living, our learning, our loving, our playing, and our traveling, it's creating a lot of mental health challenges. And for people who have mental illnesses, that stress can also lead to relapse. And so we know that there is an increased use of alcohol and substances right now. We know there's an increase of domestic violence. Couples stand at home that don't have a good relationship to begin with, don't have a good marriage, but by the fact that they have to stay at home together, unfortunately,
Doesn't help.
if it's not a healthy relationship, it'll deteriorate. So these are very hard times, not just physically, and people dying. It's also very challenging mentally for people.
This is actually interesting for me to understand. In Canada, what's the current situation for schizophrenia and maybe generally for mental health illnesses? Like how many % of the population is affected?
Well, just about anywhere you go in the world, about 1 in 4, 1 in 5 people will have a significant mental health problem.
Wow.
And 1 in 100 will receive a diagnosis of schizophrenia. 3% of the population will experience psychosis. But again, as I said earlier, that psychosis could be a symptom of epilepsy or Alzheimer's or Parkinson's disease. About 1% will be schizophrenia, and then bipolar 2 does have psychotic features associated with it. So it's a very human thing to experience mental health problems. And again, that's why mental health education, mental health promotion, and intervention. They're very critical. And we get to a place where we can talk about these things in a very normal, transparent way without any shame. Then when people begin to start having mental health challenges, they'll be more likely to go and get help, talk about it. Because it's about 7 or 8 years that a person on average will go that they will not talk about it, they will not necessarily reveal it or go get help. One of those things.
So there are still a lot of biases around, I guess, and stigma about it still, right?
Well, just the diagnosis itself. I mean, I have to remind people that I work with. Someone may say, "Well, I'm a schizophrenic." I'll say, "No, you're a person who lives with a diagnosis of schizophrenia. A diagnosis is a label; it's not your identity." Mm-hmm. So part of recovery, that is getting your life back and living to learn living beyond the limitations of a mental illness, that's called recovery. Recovery is a road to discovery. You're discovering how to live life in spite of those limitations with meaning and purpose and hope and with good mental health. But again, unfortunately, we don't have a recovery-oriented mental health system in Canada. They do much better in Australia and Scotland and Ireland and England, and even the United States is a little ahead of us. In fact, you have 25,000 employed peer support workers. It's the fastest growing occupation in the mental health system in England. Mm-hmm. So if you go to England, the number one professional occupation that's the fastest growing is the hiring of peer support workers, because they will transform the mental health system so that it's more holistic, it's more person-centered.
Let's say what exactly happens, let's say when you are in England and you have that type of diagnosis, or you feel some sort of problem, and let's compare it to Canada, because we would like people to understand what are the differences and what can be done and what can be changed.
Well, they have a different classification system in England and other countries. In the United States and Canada, it's the Diagnostic Statistical Manual. And in other countries, I think the term is ICD. England tends to be less biomedical, and on the funding, the funding follows the patient. My understanding is that the funding follows the patient, and the patient can choose those treatment options that they believe helps them to feel better, mm-hmm. helps them to recover. And so if they want to spend some of that money on being able to go to a gym for exercise, then that's allowed. I think that's a much better way. Even though we have universal health care in Canada, there are a lot of things that are not covered by our healthcare system. In fact, mental health is not even in our charter, because when universal health care came in under Tommy Douglas, who was a strong political leader of the New Democratic Party, which is sort of a socialist democratic party. He's the father of universal health care in Canada. At that time, mental illness was not covered. We had these insane asylums in Canada, and so they were operated by the federal government. And the universal health care system that we have in Canada is not operated by the federal government. The federal government funds it, but each province and territory governs and administers their health care in their own province and their own territory. And so, for example, psychological support services, it's not covered unless you're in the hospital. You will not be reimbursed to be able to see a psychologist. And so therefore, if you have trauma, unresolved stress issues, you're going through some real issues of life, you have to pay out of pocket to see a psychologist.
Wow.
So not in England though, you know, that's not to say that the English model is perfect. I think, you know, if I were a millionaire, multi-billionaire, let's say in Canada, I would have therapeutic farms. And you do have therapeutic farms in places in the United States and the wealthier parts of Canada. And people are out in nature and they can connect to self and others and creation and creatures, and there's access to various mental health supports. And so you can address you can address issues from a very holistic perspective: biopsychosocial, spiritual, recovery, culturally, all of those things. And it takes that kind of supportive, caring community for people to experience recovery. I mean, as I said earlier, recovery is really a pathway of discovery, discovering what helps and hinders your recovery and gives you meaning and purpose, so that you don't view yourself as a schizophrenic. You don't view yourself as an alcoholic, but someone who has an alcohol use disorder, which is, you know, the better term to use. People who do use substances, about 25 to 50% of them, they also struggle with mental health problems. And so we just got to clean up our language. I don't like the word addict. Nobody ever woke up one morning, went into the bathroom and looked in the mirror and said, I think today I'll become an addict. We don't understand addiction like we should. Addiction is where the pleasure center, your pleasure center in the middle of your brain, let's say you're using alcohol and you don't get the same amount of pleasure by drinking 2 or 3 glasses of wine or having 5 shots of vodka. You want to go to 10 shots of vodka to get the same pleasure. So actually your pleasure center in your brain gets addicted to itself and it needs more of the substance to get the same high. But then why are you drinking? Why are you using? That's the emotional pain. That's the self-medication theory. You know, whether it's trauma, low self-esteem, adverse childhood experiences, loss of job, death in the family. We as human beings, we find ways to cope, and that's what it is. Addictions are means of coping with huge amount of emotional pain. And then the body psychologically, or the brain psychologically gets addicted, and it's just an endless cycle. And so there's no such thing. I mean, across Canada, we open up these addiction centers, 14-day treatment. 14-day treatment is hardly going to do anything for anybody. It's long-term, and it's a multifaceted, the treatment of addiction. And when I say treatment, you now know that I don't mean just exclusively, you know, medical, but a combination of psychotherapy, peer support, psychoeducation, a healthy spirituality that's not toxic, shame-based.
That's actually so by fixing a few different factors in this system, like let's say make it more personalized, or being able for, you know, people to cover their costs, we can actually basically kill few rabbits, because it creates a whole bunch of other problems that like stuck up on the top of those 2 basic problems, and it creates then much more expenses for the societies, because then we need to deal with, you know, people that are affected, you know, over the long period of time, instead of deal and fix it early. And then, you know, like the more we understand and the more people understand, then, you know, they will be able maybe to self-diagnose somehow. Is it actually possible to self-diagnose when you have extensive knowledge of the problem?
Yeah,
Can you
Sure.
self-realize it?
Yeah. Excuse me. Most people know, that there's something wrong with them. They'll deny it simply because the stigma.
Mm-hmm.
Because no one wants to be thought of as being dangerous or crazy as you see them portrayed in the movies. So where do people get their ideas of stigma? They get their ideas around stigma from Hollywood movies, cartoons, sensational stories in the newspaper. Like here in Canada, we had a man from China who immigrated here, and he developed schizophrenia, and he thought he was the Chinese Messiah, that God had appointed him to save the world.
Wow.
And so he was to be God's servant to get rid of aliens on the earth. And so he was on a Greyhound bus. This was about 12 years ago. And he beheaded a young man. And very tragic. But yet there were two victims. There were two families that were victims of this untreated schizophrenia. There was Mr. Lee, and then there was Tim McLean and his family. So yes, again, early identification, make it normal to be able to talk about it, get rid of the slang language, and develop wraparound services for people. So in England, the services, they're called wrapped around services, what the person believes will help them. And it's shared decision making too. It's not that the patient makes all the decisions, but it's shared decision making between the patient, the doctor, and the family. That's called shared decision making.
And in Canada right now, how close are we to some kind of, that model, that system?
Well, the problem all across Canada, which is the same in the United States, in many European countries as well, is that we lack capacity and we lack resources. Mm-hmm. So because we don't put a big emphasis on prevention and intervention, we have all these bodies, so to speak, coming down this river, and the river is just flooded. And we don't have enough services. Our healthcare system is overtaxed. It's especially overloaded now with COVID-19. And so you can wait up to a year to see a psychiatrist, and you may never see a psychologist unless you're able to afford it out of pocket. We need to promote more support groups that are based on recovery. Residents, whether they're psychology or occupational therapists, social workers, mental health workers, psychiatrists, they need to be trained according to the recovery philosophy. Recovery is a philosophy, it's a paradigm, it's a movement. With a patient, it's all about a relationship. It's creating a relationship, and it's not seeing the patient through a diagnostic lens. Mm-hmm. So you're not just seeing a person through the lens of schizophrenia. You see a person who's struggling with trying to determine what's real and what's not real. And so you want to find out what has happened to that person to bring such complexity into their life. Mm-hmm. And medication is important, and most people will say that medication has helped with their recovery. But it's rare, it's very rare that someone would say medication only, just medication only did it. The people that would say that medication did all they needed would be people who had a mild presentation of a mental illness or a mental health problem. Yeah.
How much money in Canada do we currently spend in general on the mental health system?
Well, for schizophrenia, it's $7 billion. Just for schizophrenia alone, in terms of loss of life, work productivity, social supports, hospitalization. Schizophrenia is very expensive.
You said it's $7 billion a year?
Yeah, yeah.
It's a
$7
huge
billion,
number.
just in Canada, $7 billion. The burden of schizophrenia, and it's the lowest funded. So when you look at provinces here, there's 10 provinces in Canada, in 3 territories, and mental health funding is at the bottom. So when you take the whole healthcare budget here in Manitoba, which is in the center of Canada, Winnipeg, Manitoba is where I work out of. It's 27 hours north of Dallas, Texas. It's a long way.
I've been to Winnipeg actually a couple of times.
Yeah. Well, the healthcare budget is nearly 50% of the government's budget.
50?
So
50?
yeah. So when you take the whole government expenditures,
Is it?
the cost of healthcare is generally between 40 to 50%. Now, of that 40 to 50%, only about 5% is designated for mental illness and mental health. And yet, 1 in 4 people, 1 in 5, 1 in 4 people will in their lifetime struggle with a significant mental health problem. So it's way underfunded. And one of the reasons it's way underfunded is the way our healthcare system is set up, province to province, and also primarily due to the stigma. So we have a large corporation here in Canada. It's our telecommunications company. It's called Bell Canada, and they have an anti-stigma campaign every year that's called Bell Let's Talk. And so in January, they'll have a special day in which a certain percentage of all calls and texts that are made goes towards organizations to build capacity financially for mental health organizations like the Canadian Mental Health Association or the Schizophrenia Society or peer support, something like that. So yeah, they're trying to get the conversation started. But there's more talk than there is walk. So with all the talk there is about mental illness, we should be investing more, which will save lives. And economically, you can make a good case economically that it's good economics to treat mental health problems earlier on than later because of lost work productivity and work lives that could go on and work and be productive in society. And
do we have like certain mental health ministry, or is it just a certain like small department under the health ministry?
Well,
what's the structure?
Every province has a health department. There's Manitoba Health, and there used to be a mental health branch in all those departments across Canada, the health departments. But in recent years, some of the provincial governments have been removing that, and they say they're attempting to integrate mental health across the whole system so that with any health problem that you have, mental health would be addressed. I don't think that's working very well. I actually think that at this point that if you do not have a strong advocate, if you don't have an assistant deputy minister whose portfolio is mental health, I don't think much will get done, or at least not nearly as much will get done. And so it changes from time to time, and every province is different. Some provinces invest more in mental health. BC British Columbia. I think they do have a minister that's responsible specifically for mental health. Here in Manitoba, they abolished the mental health department and are working with a new system of transformation, they call it, but they're not telling us much about what that is. So it's very frustrating.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but with COVID-19, we're seeing more money being designated for mental health challenges. And the Trudeau government, Prime Minister Trudeau, released a huge amount of money about a month ago for enhanced mental health services in response to the coronavirus. And it would be great if we would keep that sustained funding up.
And also, I guess,
the government needs to bring that percentage up. Our spending on mental health, as I said, is around 4 to 5%. It needs to be around 12%, which is what it is about in Australia and in England, about 12%.
And also efficiency of the system as well.
Well,
right?
efficiency,
the efficiency
yeah.
needs to be changed.
Yeah.
I guess even if they wouldn't fund it, but change the efficiency, that would be a super huge step.
Well, it's one philosophy is called step care, one step at a time. So the earlier you reach people, step one intervention, and then depending on the severity of the mental illness and the types of supports that they need, then they would go up the steps for more intensive help and support. So that's the step care model in a very simply, explained there. And so the earlier you identify, people feel comfortable to go and get help, and the interventions are there, then they won't necessarily have to go all the way to step 5 with more intense services. So efficiency is important, but you also have to have enhanced funding too. So efficiency and
both
they go together.
And I mean, because I believe because of the COVID-19, a lot of people are uniting, and kind of we are as a society kind of have common approach to a problem where everyone tries to social distance and everyone tries to keep themselves safe. And I believe those kind of approaches also would help in a lot of problems generally around the globe, like I don't know, like global warming or even mental health. And let's maybe, for people who would watch us and who are interested in the topic, let's name a couple of the basic things that each one of us can do in order to help the situation.
Yeah. The question comes, who should be an advocate? We all should be an advocate. Doesn't matter where you are, what your role in life is. We should all be advocates to have a better mental health society, that our mental health as a society. And technology is great. Apps are wonderful. E-mental health technology is great, but it'll never substitute for peer support, being able to sit down face to face with someone and to share heart to heart and face to face. And so this disconnection that we're experiencing right now by stay at home, and even though there are wonderful commercials that are being made that we're all in this together and what have you, we were created for human connection. We were created to be able to live, learn, and love and play together, and that's what we call life. But I think we'll learn some things about the use of health technology and the internet and apps. I think this experience will show us that they can be a useful part of our healthcare system, especially people who live in rural areas or live in the far north. And there's no psychiatrists hardly up in the territories, and so telehealth conferences. In fact, I had my first telehealth appointment with my doctor. He had come back from South Africa in uh, March, and so he was in quarantine, but he was meeting with patients by telehealth. And so we had about a 15-20 minute conversation, just like you and I are here on Zoom. And it went well. But that's helpful for remote regions in crises like this. But we were created for human connection. We don't do very well in isolation and alone. Yeah.
Well, I hope, I mean, right now with everything, it seems like it's getting a bit better, and we are starting to getting out of our homes, and, you know, finally sun comes back so people can get some vitamin D, and, you know, it also reduces the anxiety level a lot. So, I mean, I'm generally usually positive about things that going around us, and I believe, you know, also the more positive approach we have, and the more we can actually do. And
well, you mentioned vitamin D. The further north you go, you have a higher incidence of schizophrenia. So people who have a deficiency in vitamin D. And so from an orthomolecular approach, that is alternative complementary medicines, I think they're very important. Working with a physician. And so omega-3 fatty acid, a particular one, there's two types, that is helpful for the brain, and vitamin D. But I'm not saying those are replacements for other supports and treatments. But again, I mean, the brain is connected to the gut, and the gut to the brain, and you know, diet is important. Good mental health is important. Healthy spirituality, knowing how to have good relationships with people.
So generally, we are still speaking about environment, like good diet, good, you know, friends, good family, healthy habits, no, like just sport in general. That what helps, I guess, against any kind of disease, you know, whether it's COVID, flu, or mental. So generally, we need to raise the discussion about just general health. That's basically it, right?
Yeah, well, in mental health, the concept is well-being, and in Canada, we spell that with a hyphen, so well-being. And so it's all about our well-being, and how do we keep well? What promotes well-being? And we know a lot, but people who are discriminated against, certain ethno-cultural groups who don't have same privileges, those who are wealthier are more educated. So the social determinants of health play a big role in mental health too. So literacy and housing and income, you see higher incidences of schizophrenia and mental illnesses in impoverished areas, in areas of poverty. When newcomers come to Canada, refugees, and those that don't have a mental illness, within 7 months, many will develop a mental health problem or a mental illness. And you know, that's a combination of stress, change of culture, a clash of Western worldview, postmodernism with more traditional states of modernity. So yeah, the stress factor is in there again.
Yeah, I mean, I've been immigrant myself. I came to Canada maybe 9 years ago. I didn't speak any English. I didn't have any friends. So I mean, it's stressful, and you also kind of feel left out of the group and of the society. So, but I mean, there are also, you can deal with it if
and if you have a stronger genetic upload, there are some people, you know, who they can have the best diet in the world, best exercise in the world. You know, they're 5'10" and they're 140 pounds, and they still get diabetes or cardiovascular problems. And so what we say there is that the genetic upload is so strong that genetics does play a critical role. And so there are some people who can practice the best of mental health, resiliency, and well-being, and there'll be some who will develop a mental illness because that genetic upload or those hot spots on the genes, certain genes, whatever they are activated. So, you know, we have to be careful how we talk about this. And that's why I say, you know, I talk about it in a very holistic way. So we've talked about a lot of things here today, from lifestyle to self-esteem to stigma, social determinants of health, access to health care, mental health care, peer support workers, medication, good family systems. There's a lot of stigma by families. I meet people regularly that say that my aunt will not let me come to my cousin's birthday party because I have schizophrenia. Or adult children will say to their parents, I don't want you to tell people that you're going to the Schizophrenia Society because I don't want anybody to know that I have schizophrenia, because it's a horrible label. And I hope we do change it in Canada. We did a survey in 2018, the Schizophrenia Society of Canada did, and 1/3 of the people surveyed strongly agreed that we should get rid of the word schizophrenia. Another 1/3 were ambivalent. But psychiatry is very adamant. They're a powerful force, and they want to stick, you know, with the DSM-5. All the DSM-5 is the Diagnostic Statistical Manual. It's sometimes called a Psychiatrist's Bible. It's basically labels that are associated with symptomology. And so it's not about blood tests. It's you talk with a person, you observe them, you see certain observations or symptoms, and then you give it a name, you give it a label. And that's why I mean, you know, it's something to hang it on, but unfortunately, though, all around the world, once a person gets that diagnostic label, they're treated. They're responded to. They're treated like a schizophrenic. They're treated like an addict, and that's all they are. That's how they're viewed. You know, so just keep them away. Make sure they're on their meds. Keep them away from my kids, and I certainly don't want my daughter dating, you know, someone with bipolar disorder. But you know, Winston Churchill, he struggled with depression. Made him a better leader, they say. He called it his, I think he called it his mad dog. Abraham Lincoln struggled significantly in the White House with catatonic depression. Servants in the White House would oftentimes see him in the wicker rocking chair. He was very tall, and he would just be, you know, leaning this way and just rocking, you know, hours on hours as he struggled with his depression. But again, it made him a great leader. People who study leaders who have struggled, you know, with depression, something about it that they have a better understanding of how to run the country. Of course, we're not talking about narcissism. Every leader has a degree of narcissism, but today we have too many world leaders that are very narcissistic and self-centered. And obviously, there's one that's talked about a lot, but I won't mention his name. And that's not a mental, excuse me, that's not a mental illness. That's a personality. That's just a personality trait. And President Trump's father was not a very nice person, and everything was defined by how much money you made. And President Trump's mother was not heard. She was in the shadows. That was the role of women. President Trump's son was supposed to inherit the dynasty, but President Trump's brother was supposed to inherit the dynasty from his father, but his brother developed depression. And so the father left everything to Donald Trump, the empire. And actually, President Trump's brother took his life by suicide. And
Wow.
I believe the president, before he was president, when his brother jumped out of a window, I believe that President Trump actually did see his brother take his own life by suicide. So the president doesn't use alcohol for that reason. But the way he grew up during that generation, that particular generation, wealthy people, yeah, it's created the man that you see today, unfortunately.
Okay. I mean, there are, I believe, even among wealthy people, mental health is still a huge problem, because like a lot of like wealthy people commit suicide. So still the question, there is no doubt that it affects like everyone, and I guess that's the basic thing that we need to understand. And also we shouldn't be, you know, afraid or kind of stereotypical about this. It's just part of our lives, like our regular flu, or you know, other kind of.
You know, in the Bible, there are 7 people that are listed as having taken their life by suicide. And King Solomon, who wrote the Book of Solomon, the wisest man, at the end of his life, and mistakes that he had made in his life, existentially, you know, he was just talking existentially when he wrote, you know, vanity, all is vanity, you know, life is vain. So wealth and success and fame, they don't give you, they don't necessarily provide you, they don't guarantee you mental health resiliency, or that you'll be immune to a mental illness. I don't think there's anything wrong with being successful and wealthy, but I think, you know, compassionate capitalism. Capitalism leads to racism and greed and segregation. And so, you know, if you're going to have capitalism, it has to be a compassionate capitalism, and wealthy people paying more in terms of supporting society, and we call those taxes. So, but yeah, you can be wealthy and have a mental illness, and you can be poor and not have a mental illness, and vice versa.
Exactly.
Yeah, no one's immune. I mean, we all go through, everybody goes through a mental health crisis sometime in their life, whether it's the death of a loved one, whether you lose your arm in a farming accident. I was born with the absence of a right hand. I oftentimes tell people I went to Louisiana and I was alligator hunting, and I didn't put the rope on the snout of the alligator right, and so they couldn't save my hand. That's how I lost my hand. But that's just a funny story I tell to audiences. But you know, people can experience mental health challenges. You know, losing your job. What we're seeing now with COVID-19, domestic abuse, losses in life. And so that's why resiliency is important, and we have to teach resiliency to our children. Resilient societies are composed of resilient communities that are composed of resilient parents who train their children and model to their children resiliency and well-being. And what's getting in the way today with Generation Z is this thing. That's
Yep.
that's their number one friend. In fact, surveys done with Generation Z or Z is that they have a closer relationship with the people they connect with on this iPhone than they do with their family members. And so you have a dopamine rush. And so the reason why you see people everywhere, doing this, even at funerals, is that there's that dopamine rush of what friends are going to be connecting with this day and getting the latest, whatever the news is, so whether it's Facebook, whether it's iPhone, and I'm not saying these are evil, I'm just simply saying they don't take the place of a relationship. And in fact, the brain is being rewired. So the studies that are being done about the use of technology as we know it today, it is rewiring the brain. And that rewiring in the neural pathways, it's not positive in terms of being conducive to positive relationships face to face. Yeah.
And also, I want to actually, because I believe there are a lot of things that technically we can continue talking about, and phones is a huge thing, and dopamine diet. There are such things as the dopamine diet. I mean, so you can, you limit yourself to the phone usage and devices usage, and you get concentrated more on real life things, so you can stabilize your dopamine level. And I mean, there are a lot that we can speak about, but also I wanted to actually share the screen of the organization that you work at, and I wanted just basically so you explain us what exactly you do, and through your organization, and what the role is. So this is it.
Well, we're an advocacy organization at the federal level, the national level, and we meet with members of parliament, decision makers who are making policy. So we want to influence policy. And those are some great videos that you're showing. By the way, that's the old website. We're going to be premiering the new website at the end of this month, hopefully around May the 24th, because May 24th is Schizophrenia Awareness Day, recognized by the World Health Organization. And we don't provide, the national doesn't provide, ground person-to-person work on the ground. That's where the provincial schizophrenia societies and other mental health organizations will meet with individuals and families and have support groups and peer support. We do have a fantastic, recognized by Health Canada, we do have a fantastic cannabis and psychosis website that was just unveiled this week. And on the banner there, you passed it a moment ago. Some of these reports are outdated. That video right there is a very popular video that the Manitoba Schizophrenia Society made. I was the CEO of the Manitoba Schizophrenia Society for 25 years up until this past March 31st, and I retired from it to go full-time with the Schizophrenia Society of Canada. And this video is very excellent, and you can find it on Manitoba Health website. You can find it on this website, the Manitoba Schizophrenia Society website, and there's also a workbook that can go along with the video. So, yeah, it talks about what recovery is, and why we need recovery-oriented mental health systems. So that's a great statement right there. I have schizophrenia. I am not schizophrenia. I'm not my mental illness. My mental illness is a part of me. And so Jonathan gave us permission to use that quote in his picture. Yeah. So, but yeah, we're upgrading this. It's actually too much information on there, and effective websites today have a lot more space and white, and less writing and less verbiage. So that reflects me. This website reflects, my information, knowledge base. Basically, people, they go to all various kinds of websites to learn about mental illnesses. What they really want to know is hope possible? Is recovery possible? And what are the skills needed as family members? What kind of skills do I need as a family member in promoting recovery for my loved one? And so we see younger families who are saying, don't give us 10 lessons on the medical model. Give us, 4 or 5 sessions, and then the other sessions be on coping skills and effective skills that promote recovery. And also, how do the family member take care of themselves mentally? Families are hidden victims, hidden healers, and there's a lot of burnout. A lot of family members develop mental health problems themselves because many are caretakers. Not everybody, or caregiver rather. Not every person who has schizophrenia needs a caregiver, but there are substantially a number. And caregivers across Canada and every part of the country. I mean, if you were to add up the value of caregivers, it would be a huge dollar amount. So we do have to provide good programs and services and supports for caregivers, not to be caretakers, because the only thing that needs a caretaker is a cemetery. But caregivers, yeah. Families feel guilty. Oftentimes they feel like they caused it. My father struggled with alcoholism. It wasn't the primary cause of my brother's schizophrenia, but it didn't help. The environment was not a healthy environment. It was a very traumatic environment. So, my father did not intentionally cause or create schizophrenia, but how he acted in the home, it wasn't a mentally healthy home. It was a very unhealthy home mentally. And I do believe that where you have homes and families that are mentally unhealthy, you're probably going to have a higher rate of mental illness. Yeah, it's just the way human life is. It's not about blame and shame.
Basically, yeah, environment is another key. So once again, working in environment, working in the healthy lifestyles and well-being, and that's, I guess.
And how do we love our neighbor? How do we love our neighbor? I mean, the second great commandment that Jesus taught was to love your neighbor as yourself. And you can read examples in the newspaper every day where we don't act very loving to certain groups of people, and like as we see a rise of domestic abuse, child abuse, and people that don't love themselves in terms of the addictions or substance use disorders that they may have. It's very complicated, but families that are supportive, loving, and caring, and you can talk about problems in an open way, are healthy families, and they tend to be more resilient. It's not that families don't have problems. All families have problems. We will all, as individuals, have problems and struggles and challenges. And some people do better and get through it better because they have a better state of well-being and resiliency. But that's not to say that you won't have a bad day. There's going to be days that we're just not quite ourselves in terms of the kind of person we want to be. So I think it's a social injustice that being one of the wealthiest countries in the world, Canada, that we only spend 4 to 5% of our healthcare budget for people who have a mental illness, and most go without help. The truth of the matter is that most people don't get help or can't get the help. And then when you start searching for help, you'll generally wait 6 months. You'll be put in the queue, and it might take you a year to get a psychiatrist. If you need housing, it may take a couple of years to get housing. So Canada's not a perfect country. No country is, obviously. I think I'd rather have the Canadian healthcare system than I would the American one, the way it is currently. But even in Canada, we don't do as well as some of the Scandinavian countries do. In Australia.
And it's also good that we are here today to talk about it, to light up the situation and to admit some of the problems, because I believe admitting anything is the first step to solve it and not to be shy about it.
Well, as I said at the beginning, I grew up in Birmingham, Alabama, born in 1952. I remember the Ku Klux Klan marching. I remember the segregated washrooms. I used them. I was a racist. I had no other choice. And so I had prejudice and stigma against people of color. Well, how did I unlearn that, Daniel? By being around people of color, getting to know them, living, learning, working, playing, praying with them, eating with them, and they with me. And it's not that you don't see color, but you see a human being. So it's not that you don't see the depression, but you see a human being who's struggling with depression. And so I'm not a racist today. I mean, I will always think other. I mean, you can't rid yourself completely of any stigma. Once you have stigma, once you have prejudice, you can never go back to zero. You'll still have a little grain of it in you, but it's not a mean, bad, evil one. So, you know, if you're uncomfortable with people that have a mental illness, even though you get educated and you become friends with people with a mental illness, there will always be a little grain of uncomfortableness, of difference. It's not uncomfortableness, it's just different. You know, like, well, they're different. They're a different color. You know, they have a different brain. Their brain doesn't operate like mine. So I don't think there's such a thing as a stigma-free society, but I think we can certainly do a whole lot better.
Minimize it, right?
You know, addressing bullying, addressing. I mean, you can disagree with people politically. You can disagree with them philosophically. You can disagree with them theologically, spiritually, lifestyle, whatever. But it never gives you room for hate language. It never justifies unloving actions. We can differ. We can have different viewpoints and opinions, but we still are to love one another as we would want to be loved and treated. It's a hard one. It's a very hard one right now around the world. It always has been. It's always been a challenge.
Well, and that's how we grow as well.
Mm-hmm.
Let's, on this positive note, I actually would like to thank you a lot for your time today. And I mean, it's been super good pleasure. And I believe a lot of people will watch it and can watch it. And I believe some people will find a lot of positive information. They will be able to find that recovery is possible and that there is nothing to be scared about and that there is nothing to be worried about. And myself, actually, I also, you know, at least at my regular life, I try to promote and advocate healthy well-being to all my friends. And I believe that also at, you know, basic level that just everyone should do. Supportive environment, healthy environment, and this is just a key to everything. And just at the end, if there is any final words, maybe some motivational speech or anything that you want to say to our viewers, you are welcome to do so right now.
Well, I don't charge to speak, so if any group wants me to come and speak, as long as they can just get me there, they will not be bored. And if anyone listening needs some help, they can go to the Schizophrenia Society of Canada website. It is under revision, and they can reach Chris Summerville. I have 2 doctorates. I have a doctorate from Dallas Theological Seminary, and then I have an honorary Doctor of Law from Brandon University for my advocacy. And I have struggled significantly with depression, suicidal depression. I've misused alcohol. I'm an imperfect follower of Jesus, so Christians are not immune to this. And so churches need to wake up, mosques, churches, synagogues, all the different faiths or religions of the world. We could be addressing this in a much stronger way too.
Okay, I guess.
So thank you very much, Daniel, and I wish you well, and stay healthy, and do the good work that you're doing, spreading hope. What you're doing is that you're giving opportunity for us to talk about hope, and just to spread that hope and faith, hope, and love. And hope changes everything. Recovery is possible. Hope changes everything. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you.